I'm Tracy Heilers. I'm the president, founder, executive director of Coalition of Schools Educating Mindfully, also known as COSEM because that's a bit of a mouthful. But I'm here with Matt Dewar today. He was our inaugural president. We're doing a little co-president here at COSEM. And each year or so, we'll see what happens in the future. I invite a different educator or former educator to share the lead with me so that we can keep addressing topics that are most relevant to educators and keep moving forward together with different visions of what COSEM can be to help us reach our potential. And I met Matt Dewar at a conference, an SEL conference in Chicago, right as I was forming my vision of this idea about a coalition, joining educators and organizations within the mindfulness and education field. And he was on a panel, and he's a well-being coordinator at his high school in Lake Forest, Illinois. And I wanted to find out more of what they were doing there. It was seemed really leading edge to me. So we talked, then talked some more. I shared my vision with him. He helped fine tune it and such. And we started just brainstorming together. And then we added more board members. I asked him to be the inaugural president to lead off our inaugural conference with a keynote. And so now we are a little over a year in to launching, and we had an idea to do a collaborative book. And we now we're launching it here. It's December, and we plan to launch in January, which is when you'll be seeing this video. The book is called Educating Mindfully: Stories of School Transformation Through Mindfulness. And we've gathered 40 different educators. Most are school educators. Many partnered with mindfulness resource organizations to write their chapters. So it's just a really fun, inspirational, conversational style book, which also creates a comprehensive resource because each of the 40 chapters, they're giving their favorite practices, what worked, what didn't work, the steps to bringing mindfulness into their classrooms, into their schools and beyond. And so we're super excited about that. And when we initially launched COSEM, I didn't do an interview of Matt. The next year when we had Toby Scruggs-Hussein, who's president this year, I interviewed her at the start and shared that in a newsletter. So I thought this would be a cool opportunity to interview Matt, who's also doing a chapter in our book. And this could be a fun way for people to learn about what the chapters are going to be kind of like in the book, to give you a little peek into what the book is about. So let me start I've got my little questions here I want to ask him. And I'm just going to ask him a few questions. He's going to answer them, and we'll see where it goes from there. So Matt, how about start by just introducing yourself, and I've kind of already introduced that you're a well-being coordinator, but maybe say a little bit about what this role entails at your school and how you came to be in this role at your school. I think hearing about your high school has a well-being coordinator position, I want that to be an inspiration for other schools. This is a possible position and a really important position that all schools should have. So I'm going to click on you here, and then you're going to let me know about that.
Hello.
Hello.
Good morning. The well-being coordinator position at Lake Forest High School grew out of the recognition that we needed to do more to address the social and emotional needs of students in a more formal way, in a more consistent way. And we needed someone who specifically looked at those needs and then attempted to create meaningful experiences and resources to most effectively and successfully address those needs. And so I liked that Dr. Holland, who's our principal, I liked that her vision for the position was never about creating a program. It was about always responding to the changing needs of students and staff. And that's the first thing we really agreed on, was that the going the way of program development was ultimately probably not in our best interest. And I can ramble about why that is if you want. But so the first thing that kind of came out of that was just looking at different trends in terms of well-being within the district for both staff and students. And right away, it's pretty universal. Everyone in the building basically identified stress and anxiety as the number one obstacle to their health and well-being. And so then it was about identifying meaningful experiences, interventions, and resources that could address that. And as I explained at the keynote at the conference, I've been practicing mindfulness personally for almost 20 years, and it's something that has been very meaningful for myself and effective. And I talked to Dr. Holland about that, and so I went and got some certifications for teaching in schools, and then we use mindfulness kind of as an initial intervention, if you want to call it. And we started with an AP, I think it was an AP calculus class. It's just a pilot. I think it was 3 sections of it. Right before AP exams, we did 6 weeks, I think twice a week leading up to AP exams. And then we just did a basic assessment after. And I think every single kid who took the assessment, I think it was 77 kids, they all said it was meaningful, valuable. They wanted more of it. They wish they had it earlier. It helped them emotionally. It helped them academically. And so right there, we got immediate feedback, and then it kind of just blew up in our district from that point. And it's evolved into a number of different things. And my position has also evolved into a number of different things as mindfulness kind of gains traction in our district. I'm looking at other things now beyond mindfulness, other interventions for helping students and staff with their well-being.
Thank you. That's a great start.
Yeah.
I didn't know quite where to jump in at. There's a lot of, I know a lot of what you've done at your school. Maybe next start with, or continue on, maybe right now, or first, how many years have you been in this role? And then like right now, what would be your week-to-week responsibilities as well-being coordinator? Because I know you also teach some other classes. And so start with week to week and then year to year, because I know there's some certain responsibilities that every year, like freshman orientation and a cool kind of ending to the year activity that you do. Share a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I've been in the position, I think this is my 5th year, and we've been doing mindfulness. I believe this is the 4th year of doing mindfulness. There really is no week to week in terms of responsibilities, because some weeks I am just stacked with meetings with instructional directors, talking about integrating SDL into curriculum, into new coursework that's emerging for the following year, doing mindfulness drop-ins for teachers, leading mindfulness experiences before school for teachers or for students. And so it ebbs and flows. It tends to, when you start hitting times of the year where well-being comes to the surface and people get stressed out, I'm in kind of high demand, and it's kind of a feast or famine type schedule. And I don't think that's necessarily ideal, but I think realistically it's hard for people. I mean, it's human nature. We tend to be reactive and not proactive. And even though ideally it would be great if we could be more proactive, and I think in general we are moving in that direction as a district, the vast majority of my schedule is dictated by collective reactive needs to stress in terms of just how the natural progression of the school year plays out. That there are certain times a year that are more stressful for everyone, and there are other times a year where everyone kind of gets into automatic pilot and starts to coast. Year to year is more focused. So specifically this year, my goal is to look at the competencies of self-awareness and self-management and talk to instructional directors about how the competencies of self-awareness and self-management are already implicitly in the curriculum of a given department. And so identifying just where it naturally shows up within the curriculum of a freshman course, a sophomore course, junior, and then senior electives. And so you get things like in the English department, we have a wonderful, awesome writing workshop program. And a part of that writing workshop program entails narrative writing, personal narrative writing. It entails conferring with peers about your piece and receiving feedback in a really nuanced way, really structured and nuanced way. It involves conferring with your teacher on every draft. And so you have this SEL dynamic right at the heart of writing workshop. And so it's just making things like that, curricular moments like that are already there, more explicitly present to students by maybe just slightly changing the language of how you talk about a given activity as a teacher. And so that this is kind of a tangent, but it's related. And that's one of the things that teachers will get anxious about and push back about, is that they think SEL is taking on new stuff and they already feel overwhelmed. And there's no doubt that there is an aspect to that about SEL, that it does mean at some point taking on more stuff. I think it's dishonest to say that it doesn't entail that at some point, but it doesn't have to start there. That it can start with by simply identifying these things that are already there, that you can just make more explicit with language. And so the idea then for my position is, by the end of this year, having all the different departments be able to articulate and map out for freshman and sophomore courses, where in these courses are the competencies of self-awareness and self-management showing up? How do we talk about them? How can we improve the ways we talk about them and integrate them? And then I'm anticipating that next year we'll be looking at junior and senior courses then, and then also taking freshman and sophomore courses to the next level, where we're asking where are their gaps. Maybe there are some courses where these competencies really aren't showing up. And so then now you're talking about, well, how can we add those in there? Can we create a common assessment that's articulated in a particular kind of way, or an activity, so on and so forth. So
yeah, I didn't realize I'm glad I asked that question to learn that. And then just go quickly over how your freshman orientation looks, because that's a great way for everyone to kind of get a foundation of and help for that that it's a stressful time, right?
Yeah. Speaking to the end of being proactive, one of the areas that I think we excel as a school is proactively communicating to freshmen the importance of SEL. And we do that through a variety of interventions, if you want to call them interventions. We have an all freshman clap-in at the beginning of the school year. Actually, the freshmen's their first day, they come in and they walk through the front hall of the school, and the senior class is there to clap them in. And sometimes it looks a little bit more like torture than, because the last thing a freshman wants is to be noticed, and they're walking down this hall and there are hundreds of people there, clapping them in, and it's a very kind of boisterous, rowdy environment. It's fun though. And then on the back end, at the end of the year, we do a clap out for the senior class. And so the idea is that you clap them in as freshmen, you clap them out as seniors, and the seniors are there clapping the freshmen in. So it becomes this nice school ritual, showing this cycle of beginnings and ends. So we do the clap in. We have all sorts of one of the things we really focused on is training upperclassmen to be leaders through a variety of experiences and curricula. We have a Sherpa program, and upperclassmen will basically take underclassmen under their wing and be advisors and confidants to the freshmen. And we have a bunch of TAs. We have a thriving TA program where sophomore year you take the course to be trained, and then junior and senior year you can be a TA. And that's been a really effective strategy. And then kind of the crown jewel of everything is a course we offer called Wellness for Life that is for all incoming freshmen. It originally started as an optional pilot course where parents could sign their kids up by choice. And it was so popular, and we realized that it was so effective in emphasizing SEL that we made it mandatory, I think 5 years ago. So now all freshmen take Wellness for Life. And so a lot of people say, well, how does that work? It's a year-long course that has health and PE folded into it. So it absorbs the state credit for health, and it absorbs the state credit for PE. But it's not just simply taking PE and health and putting them together and saying, look, we have a course. It's going above and beyond the requirements of PE and health and really intensively looking at social emotional intelligence and how do we become self-aware? How do we self-manage? How can we self-manage more successfully? One of the things that I would always talk about when I taught this course is the difference between developing internal skills rather than relying on external substances. And even though we live in a society where the norm is to manage internal states with caffeine and usually alcohol, but pot maybe, and recognizing that these cultural norms, even though it's a norm, it doesn't mean it's healthy, and it doesn't mean it's sustainable. And so this is a course where you get to look at that and look at cultural and social norms, identify myths, and not just in self-management, but in a variety of health-related topics, and then really looking at, well, how can we assume greater personal responsibility for our well-being, and what sorts of competencies and skills do we need to that end? And so this course just hits the ball out of the park. It's been very effective, and it's been so effective that we're really looking now to continue the momentum created by that course into sophomore year, into junior year, etc. And one more fixture of that class is there are upper class TAs who are really involved in that course. And so sometimes when I taught the course, we would be talking about a particular issue, making important decisions, maybe under the duress of pure pressure. What does that actually look like in real time? And I trusted my TAs enough where I would excuse myself from the class, and the TAs would take that topic, and it was planned in advance that they were going to do this, and they would speak to the freshmen in that class about the real issues and the decisions that are being made and the values that are at stake. And it's so much more powerful for a freshman to hear it from a junior and a senior who they really look up to than this guy just yapping away. So we have more, but that's the gist. I could keep talking forever.
That's great. So I want to talk about the educator, like the other teachers, a little bit here, because you say you're working with the department chairs or the instructional leads, and then they're then working with obviously their department on how to bring mindfulness and self-awareness, self-management, SEL to their classes. Has there been, like with buy-in, with mindfulness, and you said how a lot of the teachers feel that SEL is just this other thing that they don't have time in their limited timing with all the content they have to get in to add. So what, I know you have helped develop a really great professional development model for your school. So maybe go into a little of those topics for us, a little detail of the professional development model and how, any resistance you've met from the educators and such, and the details and how maybe you overcame them.
There's a number of questions in there, and I'm going to try to hit all of them. The last question you just asked about resistance, I'll start quickly with that. There really hasn't been resistance. And I think there hasn't been resistance because it's not programmatic. And one of the things about a program is that it's heavy-handed, and that it often superimposes things onto people who maybe aren't ready to operate in that way. And if they're being forced to because there's a program, then they're just going through the motions. And if you're just going through the motions, that is instructive to students. They see that. They know if you believe something, and they know if you're just going through the motions. And so one of the things that I was adamant about from day one is this is not a program. This is about, again, identifying needs in real time and finding solutions that certain people find meaningful and effective. And the idea is that if we're really tapping into universal and collective needs within our school, but really universal and collective needs that are human, the desire, I always say when I talk to teachers or students, raise your hand if you don't want to be happy, healthy, or well. No one raises their hand. So there's this intrinsic human desire to want to be those things. And then I say, raise your hand if you think that you are happy, healthy, and well. Very few people raise their hands. So the question then becomes, why the gap? If this is all fundamentally important, we're all motivated to want it, but very few of us actually have it. Then it becomes not an issue of desire or focus, but it becomes know-how. That people lack the skills to cross that, or to close that gap, to cross that kind of chasm between wanting to be well and actually feeling well. And so my point in rambling is that it's so important to not be heavy-handed. It's so important to try to always think about and believe that people want to be well, and if you keep putting out quality experiences, more and more people are going to be impacted, and more people are going to be interested. And I think that's the right approach. At least it's been the right approach in our school, because when I look back to 4 years ago, for example, starting mindfulness interventions, the people who I'm doing mindfulness interventions for now are completely different. So every year, new people are coming into the fold, right? And they're doing so because they're hearing from colleagues that something was really effective for their students. And then they think, oh, well, maybe I'll give this a shot. And then they reach out and we sit down and we talk. And I say, hey, I can make this whatever you want it to be. I can come in for 15 minutes before an exam just to help everyone calm down. Or I can come in for 45 minutes and talk about a particular issue that you're having in your class in terms of maybe class chemistry or follow through or self-advocacy or whatever, and tailor it to the needs of your particular classroom. I've even had with teachers come in and do a mindfulness lesson integrated into a unit that they're doing. For example, one was on, it was an English teacher. They were doing something on transcendentalism, and they were reading Thoreau and Emerson. So I wove in a whole mindfulness piece, utilizing passages from Thoreau at Walden, and so it can take any form, because again, the driving impetus behind everything is, what are your needs and how can I best serve those needs? In departments as a whole, at the beginning of this work, there were certain departments that were clearly not as open to this type of stuff. And I think typically, from speaking with educators at other schools, these tend to be departments that are really locked into content. And that's not their fault. It's just a very content-oriented curriculum. And usually that's math and often science. And it's very hard to integrate SEL, mindfulness type stuff, into math and into science, right? Doesn't mean it can't be done and that it can't be done well, but it's just harder to do it. It's less intuitive. And so now these are departments that are actively involved in doing this stuff. In fact, our science department, our instructional director for science, is helping teachers create a universal now freshman science class where everyone's going to be taking it. And he wants to really embed a lot of this SEL stuff. And I talked to him about, well, let's look at potentially creating a unit in the course of that class that looks at the biology and physiology of stress mechanisms and how things like respiration and Stanford and UCLA at the Krasnow lab 2 summers ago just discovered that the emotional centers of your brain and your respiratory centers are tied via a shared pathway of neurons. We've always kind of intuitively known this, but they actually found these neurons speaking back and forth so that in every given moment, your level of emotional arousal has its own respiration rate unconsciously, right? And that by consciously taking a hold of your breathing, you can actually work backwards to your emotional centers. And so by slowing your breathing down, guess what happens to your level of emotional vigilance? Softens, it comes down. Well, that's fascinating stuff. And there's a lot of science at the heart of that. Why not integrate something to that extent within the freshman course? So we're looking at now doing stuff with stress management, mindfulness, self-awareness, how these are all biologically, physiologically mediated skills and competencies and practices. And so, yeah. And then, sorry, so that's
part one.
That's part one. I'm long-winded today. So there hasn't been pushback. because I think the approach has been fundamentally inclusive from the beginning. And because it's been inclusive and because it's patient, because we're not running to get somewhere fast, we've got a nice steady pace, and more people are coming on board over time. And I think that's, in my experience, that's the best approach. In terms of the professional development model, 3 years ago, and I spoke about this at the end of the keynote at the conference. 3 years ago, I created a professional development model that has 3 components: teacher identity, teacher well-being, and then classroom experiences. And that progression might seem counterintuitive in 2 ways. One, because it starts with teachers, and not students, or a teacher focus and not a student focus. And 2, because classroom experiences are the 3rd component. And usually professional development begins with the classroom immediately, the know-how, the how-to, the technical aspect of instruction. And I personally think that's an error, both of those intuitions. And we'll start with the first. All the research is now showing that if you want to move the needle, you got to start with teachers. Why? Because for most schools, teachers are the enduring culture. Administrators come and go, students come and go, parents come and go, teachers remain. And so because they are there for the longest period of time, they collectively make up the culture, the atmosphere of a school. And I'm not saying that's wrong, and I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that's what's happening because they're simply there the longest. And so if you really want to change the culture of a school, you have to start by changing the consciousness of the teachers. And that takes time. And I know the pace and the rate of an administrator is often more urgent than the pace and rate of a teacher. And that's because these clips of time that they're operating within in a given place are different. Administrators know they've got maybe 5 years, and in those 5 years, they have to do something of value. And so they're going to push. So they're running a sprint. And then you have teachers, for example, like in my district, they're going to be there for 35 years. So they're moving at a different pace. Doesn't mean they're not moving. And I think this is so important for administrators, is they get frustrated with teachers that they're not on board fast enough. It's like, well, you got to understand that when you leave, they're still here, right? And that's really important. They're still here with the next batch of kids. And when those kids leave and the parents with them, those teachers are still there. And so it's not that teachers aren't moving. It's that they're moving at a different rate because the nature of their game, kind of the parameters of their career are just different. And so I think in many instances for administrators, it's in their best interest to take a breath and slow down. And at least, and I'm not saying teachers don't need to be pushed, but you need to understand what it's like to be a teacher, and that they're in the trenches every day, and that they're dealing with in real time these issues that administrators are dealing with in the abstract. And it's really important to recognize that there's a fundamental difference there. Where was it going with this? I don't even remember.
Well, maybe in those 3 components of the professional development, share a little bit of what is covered in each one. Yeah.
You're a good listener. I'm surprised you.
I'm glad you said all that about administrators, though, because that made me think of, let me click on myself. That made me think of our Administrator Academy. So we, so I have to do a little shout out for it. We worked with DuPage. Yeah, go ahead. Or I was
just saying, sign up.
Yes. We have it at a conference, and we have approval by ISBE for the next 3 years to do it. And so, and Matt Dewar, and then also Tovi, our current president, and Jean Olson, who's director of student services, Glen Ellen District 89 are doing it. So just how you're talking right now and mentoring, I feel like it's a great mentorship opportunity for administrators to be able to spend some time with Matt, Toby, and Jean. All right, so back to you. That's the commercial. Now back to you.
Back to your regularly scheduled programming.
Yes.
So that's the first intuition, why it's so important to start with with teachers. The second intuition is that professional development should start with the technical aspects of teaching. And that's it's just not true. And it's not true because I've seen, every administrator especially has seen, and I'm sure other teachers have seen, though we're kind of limited to our own classroom as teachers, so we don't see the universal aspects of a school as much. But administrators see all the time that you can provide the most sound instructional practices and framework and curricula and just everything. And you can still get a teacher in a given instructional space and in a given instructional moment who's just not doing good enough. Okay. And so as much as we want to reduce teaching to a science and a kind of paint by number profession, right? Paint by number art, you paint in the different things. Well, just because you can make a paint by number painting doesn't mean you're an artist. And just because you can go and implement a bunch of instructional best practices in theory doesn't mean you're a good teacher. And so there's a whole that's larger than the instructional parts. And that whole is the identity of the teacher and how they understand who they are and how that is translated and communicated in their instructional space. And as I said at the conference last year, and you can tell when you're talking to people when you say something and everyone's antenna suddenly is receiving what you're saying. And in the course of that talk, when I was looking out at the crowd, when I talked about teacher identity and the fact that you teach with who and how you are more than with any instructional technique or method or curriculum, all of a sudden I could tell that every person in that room, I had their undivided attention. That there's something we really deeply understand about that we can't hide who we are when we walk into an instructional space. And I'm not saying that teaching isn't a science or that there aren't scientific aspects of instruction and that there aren't best practices, but good teaching isn't reducible to those things. And that you can have all of those things and still have an empty educational experience and an ineffective educational experience. And what it comes down to is that teachers really aren't given enough time or space to think about who they are and why they're doing what they're doing. Because we all forget. Right? We might have started so motivated, wanting to change the world, wanting to do all these things, but the bottom line is teaching is a grind. And it gets the best of every single one of us at some point. And when it does, and you get tired and you get burnt out, you lose perspective and you forget why you're doing what you're doing, and you just show up. And when you just show up, that communicates more than anything else. And so starting the professional development model with teacher identity, I think, is essential, because it says that it also validates to the teacher, because teachers often feel that they're marginalized and abstracted, right? I mean, this is the source of all negativity, really, in any department that you walk into in a school, when people are just yapping away and drinking their daily dose of negativity. And that is that they feel that their individuality in some way is not being appropriately regarded. And so when you create a professional development model that says, no, your identity and who you are is the most important thing, you've suddenly just breathed life back into a teacher. And sometimes you've just reminded them of what they once distinctly and vividly knew and have forgotten over time. And so you have to resuscitate that, you have to revive that and wake that up. And my experience doing professional development within my own district and doing this work with other districts has been that it's the single most meaningful piece that I get feedback on. Where if I lead a retreat of some kind and I go home and all of a sudden I get an email from a number of teachers saying, I haven't felt like this about my teaching in 20 years. And it's just because there are parts of ourselves that fall asleep. No matter how good we are, it doesn't mean we're bad or whatever. It's just life. Life is a grind. And being a teacher, we internalize everything. We care about our students. There's so much in the teaching profession that is outside of our control. And we're reminded of that every day. And yet we care so much in an environment where we have so little control. That's not a good combination, right, for personal health. And so we get burned out, and we just need to be reminded of that. And then once a teacher wakes up to that sense of identity, getting them to look at, how do I take care of myself? Because again, teachers forget to take care of themselves. They take care of everyone else, and they forget that their capacity to do that well or to do anything well really hinges on, are they filling up their own battery? And so many teachers will grind and they don't realize that if they just took time to recharge and value self-care, that they would be doing their work more effectively and more efficiently. But we have, again, this failed intuition that there's a shortage of time. And because there's a shortage of time, we can't take care of ourselves. That's a luxury. And we just need to put our head down and grind. But when you do that and you go into that survival mode, you're not doing anything well. You're not helping anyone. And you're especially not helping yourself. And so by honoring and valuing self-care time and self-care protocols and creating some sort of practice of self-care, you're actually ensuring that you're going to be taking better care of the people who you oversee. And then once you have that identity piece, that well-being piece up and running and thriving, or at least just up and running, hopefully thriving, then you talk about, how do I take that identity and that sense of well-being? How do I channel that into my work as a professional in an educational space? And so that's when it makes sense to look at, what are the most effective tools that I can use to kick ass in the classroom, right? But so much of professional development, again, just starts there, and it ignores those two other domains. And it's just, it's empty and it's doomed to failure to start there, in my opinion. So that's kind of our professional development model, and it's been a pretty cool experience sharing that progression and that work within my own district and in other districts, because it's I obviously created that progression because I thought it was important, but I never really realized just how important it was until doing the work and then seeing how folks respond to it. And it's like, wow, it's actually a much deeper and bigger issue than I thought. So yeah.
That's great. I'm clicking on myself here. Oh, there we go. Okay, so you've given us some wonderful, and maybe we just end with, you talked about self-care as one of the main components of professional development, and you are leading a post-conference workshop at our Educating Mindfully conference. This is going to be March 1st, is the Sunday that you'll be doing a full day. So maybe talk about a little about what you're going to be sharing for that full day workshop. And one thing that maybe you can also share about, that I'm guessing you'll be sharing at your workshop, which is called Mindfulness in the Journey of Self-Care. One thing from your keynote that I loved, one of the many things, is that you talked about how stress is a distorted relationship with time. And talking with different presenters after the fact, they kept bringing that up to me, that really struck them as something they hadn't thought of before, and how mindfulness can help with that. Okay, so go. Those are your two last topics to talk about.
So the time piece, I think, that is so important, just as human beings, is that time is our most valuable resource. And again, I think it's you hear me throughout the course of this talk identifying and talking about intuitions that lead us astray. We have certain intuitions about how things are.
Or like limiting, I think of that almost as a limiting belief as well, as or rather than maybe an intuition. Or
and it's limiting because it's unquestioned. It's just assumed to be a given. And so I think maybe the biggest false intuition, or intuition that we're the least critical of, is the fact that we act as if time is a renewable resource. It's our most valuable resource, and yet we constantly act as if it were renewable, and we waste it. We just wish it away. We watch it pass, and we fill it with things that don't necessarily represent fully how valuable our time actually is. And I briefly mentioned in the talk that I really first became aware of this in watching my grandfather and being with him in his final months and weeks and days, is that it's very possible to, never before in human history have we been so able to indefinitely live in a state of denial and distraction. And it's really actually possible to spend the majority of a life completely distracted from what life actually is, and only to eventually arrive at a point where you realize that intuition that you were uncritical of is a false intuition, and that you really don't have enough time to do something about it. And that was the case with my grandpa. And when I saw that, it was just gripping to see someone realize that so much of their life had been spent without actually understanding or honoring the value of time. And so what ends up happening is I think the biggest symptom of our time that's associated with stress and anxiety is time scarcity. We think we don't have enough time, and we don't have enough time because we've forgotten what we value, or we've forgotten how important time is. And because we forget how important time is, we end up filling it with all sorts of things that are perfunctory and peripheral and not as urgent as we think they are. And I think I called it at the conference the symptom of preoccupation with the insignificant. That when you forget about what you value, everything becomes important. And when everything becomes important, everything stands forth as if it needs to be urgently addressed. And we have technologies and all sorts of things that just play into this neurobiologically, that I have to respond to this text, I have to write this email, I have to do this right now. And so we start stringing this together moment after moment, day after day, week after week, month after month, and your brain is just entropy. There's no focus. There's no, Soren Kierkegaard, the existentialist, said the purity of heart is to will one thing. How many of us will one thing? So many of us, we're willing 1,000 things at once, and we're trying to do them all in a given day. And so this ends up leading to this self-perpetuating cycle of a lost sense of value. Everything becomes important because there's no distinction to find what's really important and what you can just say no to, which then means you're preoccupied with all sorts of insignificant things. And that all of a sudden, then sooner or later, you realize you're not getting done what you need to get done. And so now you've got to hurry to get things done. And then there's not enough time to do it. And then it feeds in again. And you're just, I mean, this is everyone's life. We're just running around, like my mom used to say, like a chicken with its head cut off. And so mindfulness and the journey of self-care is, how do we interrupt this? Because you have to. And if you don't, then it's just, it's the equivalent of jumping into a river with a strong current. And if you're not doing anything, you're just going where the current's going. And in the current of life right now, what is normal, if you're living with the norm, you're going somewhere you don't want to go. Which means you have to, at some point, fight the current and interrupt it. And so I think our time on that Sunday, the last day of the conference, is about what would life look like if you stood up to that current? What would life look like if you led with your strongest sense of value? What would your life look like if you actually honored and lived in accordance with what is most important? And that doesn't mean be perfect, right? But it just means more often than not, you can fall back on and lean into your values, and you know that they're there, you know that they support you, and you know where they're ultimately leading you. And I'll close with, I think I also mentioned this in the talk, that mindfulness, if you look at the etymology of mindfulness, it comes from a word that means to remember, a Sanskrit word that means to remember. And so implicit in the idea of remembering is that we forget. And so mindfulness then becomes this practice of remembering, of coming back to what we forget, which is our sense of value, our sense of the sanctity of the present, the how stillness and silence are ultimately, if we're patient, there's nothing more life affirming than the gifts of stillness and silence. And so mindfulness is remembering our better nature, and it's remembering that life and self-care are a journey, and that we're always in the process of becoming who we are, and that process invites us to be actively involved with it. I think that's a huge piece, is that the reason why it's the journey of self-care is because a journey means we're not at our destination. We're in this process of becoming, and that becoming needs our awareness. It needs our attention. It needs our skills. And so we're actively kind of fashioning our lives as we live them. And I think that's the most important thing, is that when we think about well-being, we're talking about a life where you're actively involved in your own journey and constantly remembering and reflecting to come back to what's important. Drop the mic on that.
I say so. I was going to say that. Thank you, Matt. I think this is going to be really empowering and inspirational for a lot of people. Thank you.
Hope so. Thank you for having me. And thank you. I'll just say to everyone out there, Tracy is so awesome, and I'm so appreciative of her just randomly emailing me after that conference. And then we probably talked, I don't know, 2 or 3 times on the phone after that. And I remember thinking, this lady, she is very motivated. And you hadn't really shared your vision yet. You were just asking all these awesome questions.
You're talking about after you were in the panel and I met you at the conference?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, okay, I thought you meant after our conference. Yeah.
And we had 2 or 3 conversations, and they were great conversations, and you were asking really cool questions. And I remember thinking, what is she working on? Like, what is she envisioning? And then at some point, you
Release the crack, yes.
unfolded the vision, and I was like, wow, impressive. And you embody everything I was just referring to, is that actively being a participant in your own journey. So you are a model for the journey of self-care. So thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, okay, and right before we leave, I now that I've known Matt and become friends with him the last year or so, I've gotten to see even further all the gifts he has to offer for the world, and as a friend. So in this vision for creating this book that we're collaborating with 40 or more people on, I knew Matt had some book ideas. So as we were talking to some different publishers, and it was in the air, the book creation was in the air. So tell us just briefly about this new book that you're working on with New Harbinger.
Yes. Yeah. Right now it's called the Mindful Breathing Workbook for Teens. Teens might be shifted to young adults. That was the feedback all my students gave. Said teens is condescending, young adults is better. So, but the Mindful Breathing Workbook for Teens, and it's basically really drawing from the research that's been done at Stanford and UCLA and a number of other places, and just looking at, when we talk about mindfulness, sometimes I've found that in teaching it, when you just talk about paying attention, it's so abstract, this idea of attention and shifts in attention and how to move attention when it narrows, which are all invaluable skills. But for the beginner, especially the young adult beginner, it can be really hard to understand what that is. And so by focusing the introduction of mindfulness on breathing, this really gives them something concrete and specific to focus on. And when you talk about developing the skills of self-awareness and self-management, the breath is so amazing because it's one of two autonomic processes that we have that we can take conscious control over, and the other is our vision. And when we pay attention to our breathing, it can become a barometer, an emotional barometer of what we're experiencing in any given moment, so that I know my breath never lies, because the breath is really the messenger of my physiology. And so when my breath is dysregulated, I can notice that. It's very concrete. And when I notice that my breath is dysregulated, I then actually can change my breathing. So breathing is the barometer, but it's also the vehicle through which I can change my state. And I've found that over the last 4 years, by really focusing on breathing and specific breathing techniques, that students, it's much easier for students to start developing a practice and immediately see the changes that can be made by working with the breath. And so that's the idea behind the book. How it's different than, I think, other mindfulness books is it's really just on how can we use our breathing to develop self-awareness and improve self-care.
I think this is going to be one of many future books that you'll be writing. So I'm excited to have it come to fruition. So, all right. Thank you, Matt. I'm going to let you back to your Sunday and your Bears game. And thank you.
Go Bears.
Go Bears.